Welcome to the Thunder and Lightning Show. I'm here with Ryan the Retrograde.
Greetings.
And today we're going to talk about the future of the Novus Ordo. Now at this point, I'm going to assume that most of you watching were not able to attend Mass, or at the very least not able to receive communion. Now with the parishes and dioceses being shut down completely for who knows how long, the Novus Ordo is going to look a little bit different. Our country is going to look a little bit different. And I know, Ryan, in the last show you mentioned a little bit about some of the changes that might take place in the Novus Ordo, how a lot of priests, they will be saying private masses and they will be saying the Latin Mass. And another thing I also thought of was that I think the death toll in Italy is up to 30 priests that have died,
Wow.
which is really unfortunate. I mean, I don't wish for any priest to die. But unfortunately, a lot of our priest population is elderly, especially in the Novus Ordo parishes. They have really big problems with vocations, newer priests. So that's one of the concerns that I have, and I just want to open it up to you, Ryan, and see what your thoughts are on the future of the Novus Ordo. How do you think it's going to look? And we'll just go from there.
Yeah, thanks, John. So we're here in an undisclosed location, not in our usual location, because of Corona mania and the epi-pandemic that is going on now. And so we come to you from the underground and the catacombs, so to speak, although it's quite bright in here because we have lots of windows. But they are virus-proof windows, I will have you know. So we are safe here in our secondary location. I did some brainstorming because you said, hey, let's do a show tomorrow. So now some of this stuff is about the schools and seminaries. Now, seminaries is something important here, but I'll address those later. So I believe it was on last week's show, the show that came out on Monday. It was a rather long show where I talked about many different things. But one thing I pointed out was that this exile, this suspension, this interdict, and that's basically what it is. Because now, when a priest is accused of some kind of misconduct with a minor, the first thing that happens is the bishop suspends them, basically. They're removed from the parish, they're sent to an undisclosed location, they're said, okay, you can't say Mass in public, you can't hear any confessions, you can't function as a priest. Even though there's been no trial, we haven't had a cross-examination, examined the witnesses, no canonical proceedings or whatever, you're just under arrest, basically. And you're guilty until proven innocent. And in that sense now, every Novus Ordo priest in this entire United States of America is now under a suspension and an interdict. So think about that. Every priest is now being treated as if he is a molesting pervert. Every one of them is suspended. Every one of them is not allowed to say a public Mass. Every one of them is curtailed severely. Some of them have their churches locked. They're not allowed to give Holy Communion. As you said last week, some bishops are even canceling baptism. And if you're doing that, you are basically you're an apostate. This is now an apostasy amongst the hierarchy here. And I don't blame priests, because priests are not the architect of this apostasy. This started with, I don't know if it was the Archbishop of Milan or whether it was the Pope himself that started the closing and the cancellation in Italy. And as soon as they could, some bishops here in the United States of America, they could not even wait. The ink's not even dry on the newspaper about what's going on in Rome. And they're like, cancel, man, cancel. You think about, why were you ordained a priest? Wasn't it to offer the sacraments, to help people as they're dying? If there's a plague spreading, you gotta anoint. But these guys couldn't wait to cancel. No public Mass. We don't want to be around anybody. Why? Because you're dangerous. Okay, so gee thanks. My father, the man who I thought was my father, the bishop, the pope, the parish priest, again, I'm going to leave the parish priest out because he's suspended now and under interdict, but the pope and the bishops, they've basically said, you are a red-headed stepchild, and I'm not helping you. You're like calling up your father. I'm stuck in the ditch. My car has a flat tire. And then he says, oh, it's too dangerous out there. I could get the virus. Sorry, son, you'll have to fend for yourself. But Father, I don't know how to change a tire. It's muddy. I'm slipping. I can't get out of this hole. I'm sorry, son. You'll have to die. I'll pray for you as I'm here on my couch eating potato chips and watching Simpsons reruns. I will pray for you, and don't worry, God loves you, and you can always make an act of perfect contrition and make a spiritual communion. So that's what the Pope and these clown bishops have said to us now. As the Gordon brothers have called it, this is the age of the absconding father, and we see yet again, we've had Benedict quit, Francis apparently had ordered all the churches to be closed in Rome, but then he recanted when some certain bishops said, oh, this is stupid, I'm reopening. But still, every bishop in the United States of America has locked their churches. Under whose orders? Who's running things here? You know, we discussed this off camera. Is it the government that's issued an edict? And since when can the government issue an edict that says close your churches? I guess all of those apostles and those early Roman Christians during the persecution, why didn't they just do what the authorities said? They should have stopped gathering together. They should have thrown all of their scriptures in the fire. They could have just offered a pinch of incense to Caesar or whatever idol it was. They could have gone home and had a nice meal with their family. I guess they didn't get the message. They didn't have the church of the accompaniment and the new advent, the new evangelization, and the new everything else. Because for some reason they thought that they owe adoration to God rather than Caesar. Now, all that as a preface. So, back to the question at hand, which was, how will the Novus Ordo be different after all this disaster, this suspension, this interdict is over? And the first thing I said is, let's just consider the priests who are, now they're locked up, and they don't have to worry about Susan from the parish council anymore. She's not going to be there watching your mass and saying, Father didn't turn to me and say, offer the sign of peace. Father didn't offer the chalice. Father didn't have altar girls at his mass. I'm so angry. My rainbow flag was not hung up before mass began, and so I am excluded, and I do not feel the welcome from this parish. So there's not going to be the Susan at the parish council who will be there. So, as we talked about last week, there was that particular priest who has Lou Gehrig's disease. He was on a Taylor Marshall show, and he said, man, I'd love to be able to celebrate the old Mass every day. But I can't, because I have my Susan from the parish councils, my old ladies and everything, who they'd kill me if I said the old Mass every day. And so that priest and every other priest, may God grant that there be all of them, can now in private say the old Mass every day, if they don't know it, practice the old Mass every day, brush up on the rubrics, teach other priests the old Mass. I don't know how many priests watch this channel. If there are any, consider this. You now have the opportunity to be an evangelist for the return of tradition in the Catholic Church. And so please call and keep the brotherhood of the priesthood tight, support each other through this suspension and interdict, and offer to each other and say, hey, I've been saying the old Mass, I've had great spiritual benefits, and let me teach you the old Mass. Another thing that's going to happen here is, even if a priest is saying the new Mass under this suspension or interdict, he will very quickly think about something, and that will be, why am I out here facing, when I'm saying Mass, nobody's here, besides the angels and saints, why am I facing out in this big bunch of empty pews with my back to this tabernacle, with the real presence of Jesus Christ, body, blood, soul, and divinity? Why don't I turn around and face that? I can have an altar crucifix there, and everything will be going ad orientem, as is the tradition. And so I don't need to turn my back to the one person who happens to be there, and that's the person of Christ under the Blessed Eucharist. So I think that one thing that will happen is that as priests, depending on, hopefully, I was about to say, hopefully this suspension lasts a long time. Because if this suspension lasts a long time, all the bad habits of these priests will be broken. And they will begin to celebrate Mass as it truly is, as it actually is, as a sacrifice, rather than some kind of junior high or elementary school play where they're making gestures and they're saying prayers, let us pray, and they're traipsing about and with their flowing chasubles and putting on a show and smiling, making sure that they have their teeth whitened as they smile and say, let's pray together the Our Father. Hopefully that stuff's over and we never see a priest's face again, except when he turns around and says Domine Pisco, or when he preaches a sermon. So that's one thing that I'm thinking.
Now, I do have a side note there. Well, first, I don't know if I mentioned it on this channel before or not, but I think every Mass should be ad orientem, every Novus Ordo Mass, because of course, obviously, every Latin Mass is ad orientem. And the second thing is, I saw something online, I forget where the priest was from, but he asked parishioners to send him selfies, and he taped them to the church pews so that when he was preaching he could see their faces. So I don't know if he will be doing ad orientem anytime soon, but for the rest of the priests who don't do something like that, it is a good idea. So
yeah. Hopefully, God willing, that priests may be less willing to give people communion in the hand when the people return. That will only happen if they have a greater reverence for the Eucharist once this thing is all over. And it's going to require the people to have a greater reverence for the Holy Eucharist when this thing is all over. And God willing, that will happen. That should be in our prayer intention, because thanks be to God that there is no communion in the hands. This is probably the first Sunday since like the 70s where in the United States of America, nobody received a communion in the hand today. Nobody. Probably some people were given communion, as servers with their private Mass or outside of Mass. But God willing, they received kneeling and on the tongue. God grant it, let this be the end of the sacrilegious communion in the hand. And let this be a purification of our reverence and of our reception of the Holy Communion.
Maybe this is a side note, but I know I've watched Father Richard Heilman's videos, and he said that he installed a communion rail in his church.
Yeah.
And whenever he did, even at the Novus Ordo, a lot of people would kneel at the communion rail and receive on the tongue. And so I thought, a lot of churches don't have communion rails, but a lot of people, their eyes might be opened whenever they're watching Mass at, Father Richard Heilman, his church is St. Mary's Pine Bluff. You can find that on YouTube. Or one of these Latin Masses, they'll see these beautiful communion rails and they'll say, hey, why can't we have one of those in our church? I'll pay for it. And I think really that could be another positive aspect of the shutdown. I mean, it's a very small positive aspect. But it's definitely something that I considered about the laity, being more exposed to the traditional Latin Mass.
Yes.
And just kind of, I don't know if I'm stealing your thunder.
No, and I thank you for saying that, because I didn't write it down, but it's one of the things that I thought. For instance, in this diocese, the bishop says, well, I'm going to be celebrating my usual TV Mass at the usual time, so you can all turn in. And I'm thinking, well, the only people who watch are these old people anyway, who really don't have the internet and YouTube. If you are anybody younger than 65 or 70 who is on the internet,
if you're watching this video.
Yeah, basically our audience here. Maybe there's somebody here that's 80. God bless you, and I am glad you watch this channel, and you will listen to this point with great anticipation. And the point is this, that when you're on the internet, you have access to anybody's Mass that you want to see. And so, would you want to go see your garden variety Novus Ordo with the lousy guitar music and the cantor who's singing a quarter step off and wailing like a cat as they sing the greatest hits of the 60s, 70s, and 80s, courtesy of the worship hymnal and the St. Louis Jesuits and whatnot, and to see a bishop wearing a burlap sack with a deacon with his flood alb, and not even wearing a dalmatic. He just has on a flood alb, which is a foot up from the ground. That way his feet don't get wet when the pipes burst and the sanctuary floods. And he's got, of course, his sash on, which is just this single colored purple thing. Today maybe they wore rose. But all these vestments are burlap, and they're up there, and it's like you're watching a Methodist liturgy. And so now that's your choice. So are you going to watch that, or are you going to say, you know what, maybe I'll watch, here's Institute of Christ the King. Wow, that's a nice chasuble they're wearing. Or Father Heilman's parish. Wow, that's a beautiful sanctuary. Look at those statues and the altar. Wow, that's pretty. And they'll find whatever there might be, as we discussed before. There's many good, beautiful liturgies, Latin masses that are on YouTube. And so this is God willing, the people who are at home that are watching Mass on the internet, even if they go, and let's say they just tune into their bishop's, low church Novus Ordo with burlap sack vestments. Now it's in the YouTube algorithm that they will get suggestions for Masses. Eventually, somewhere in there, they'll see a beautiful photograph of a beautiful vestment and a priest in a liturgy, and it will be a Latin Mass. And so those people now will be exposed to tradition. And eventually, they'll be interested, and they'll watch that video, and then they will see, as you said, the altar rail. And if it's an older video, then they'll see people receiving communion at the altar rail, and they'll hear the choir singing beautiful Gregorian chant, and they'll see the reverence. And it can be an opportunity for the Holy Spirit to work and to change people's idea about the liturgy and about the art in the sanctuary. The tying in with that is the priest celebrating in his closet, basically, since he's all locked up. So he has his altar in the closet, no lay people allowed to be around. So now he has to get his mind right, and he will very quickly, if he doesn't leave the faith and get depressed, quit the priesthood or whatever, he'll have to understand that the Mass is about the sacrifice. It's the offering of the victim Jesus Christ in an unbloody fashion to God the Father for the living and the dead, and the remission of sins, and the calling down of graces upon the whole world, etc., etc. So now that they're not focused on this preaching, they're not preparing this message, they don't need to worry about how they're acting during the Mass, as I said, are their teeth white, make sure that there's no remnants of breakfast there when they smile. Then they can focus on the art of celebrating the Mass and do a reverent liturgy for God Himself. Wanted to move on to here's one more thing about priests. Priests will learn that Holy Communion can be distributed outside of Mass. So in many places the bishops have said, no sacraments in the church, no gatherings of 10 or more people, no Mass, lock the doors or whatever. But in a lot of places they haven't said no Holy Communion, because they're thinking, their brains are just totally Novus Ordo focused. And I think pretty sure in the Novus Ordo you can't give communion to anybody outside of Mass, maybe in a communion service or whatever, unless they're dying or something. But in the Roman ritual, the norm for people receiving Holy Communion back, let's say more than 60, 70, 80 years ago, was outside of Mass. And so there's a little ritual that begins with the priest goes up to the altar. There's a server where the lay people kneeling at the rail recite the Confiteor. The priest gives them an absolution, and then he takes the Blessed Sacrament out of the tabernacle and turns around. He does the Ecce Agnus Dei. All the people do the Domine non sum dignus, and he gives them all the Holy Communion. And then he goes back and cleans up himself and recites some prayers and puts the Blessed Sacrament away. Then he gives a blessing at the end. dismisses the people. So this ritual is in the this rite is in the Roman ritual, and so any priest can give the Holy Communion outside of Mass. And if the bishop says, "Oh, it can't happen in the church," well, then the priest just says, "Okay, so the church is closed. I will take my picks." And Joe Blow and Jane Blow and their son Billy Blow have requested a Holy Communion, and they say this is of grave necessity, we need to receive. So, Father X, will you communicate us? We'll be kneeling over across the street or whatever, or in our car or in our home or who knows what undisclosed underground location, and the priest can give them their Holy Communion there, provided they're properly disposed and they fast. But my warning is, don't abuse this, because this isn't, the Holy Communion is not some magical act or whatever. You have to be properly disposed and fasting and prepared. So don't do this on a whim, and don't do this too frequently, because as we discussed last week, I was trying to dissuade people from doing too frequent of a communion, especially now that we are under this interdict and suspension. Maybe you should only be communicating once a month on like first Saturday or first Sunday or something, if you even decide to do that. But because you can always make a spiritual communion, which according to I think Taylor Marshall was talking about this in one of his shows. The graces that you get can be as much as you would from the sacramental communion. So don't discount the spiritual communion. And one last thing about we're talking about priests here. It's an opportunity for, I don't know if this is really an opportunity, but one danger here is that the bad priests may, some of them probably will, retire through this thing. They'll quit, or they'll just run away and get a mistress or something, because they're going to say they really don't have much faith. That's why I called them a bad priest. And they're going to say, this is too dangerous. I don't want to get coronavirus. People are calling me, bugging me. And they think it's like, this is like I Am Legend out there, that there's zombies that come out. And so, they're just scared to death. I don't know why. I'm assuming they're still going to the grocery store. They can look out the window and see cars going by, people walking. Yesterday, Saturday, I saw more people out walking than probably any day I've ever seen maybe in my life. There was families, everybody had a dog, they were out taking a stroll. And so they're not scared to death of some virus or whatever, they're just going walking on the biking path.